Hi there, I'm Chuck Todd, and welcome to another episode of Meet the Press Reports. As the country celebrates Juneteenth, the day after the end of the Civil War, when enslaved black Americans in Texas finally learned of their freedom, we're going to look at one of the more divisive issues facing the country today. Should America pay reparations to its black citizens for hundreds of years of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and other forms of institutional racism? Calls for reparations have grown louder in recent years following the death of George Floyd and what's been called America's reckoning with race. An increasing number of cities, states, and universities are considering their own form of reparations. My colleague Ron Allen has been covering the debate in California, and he traveled there to take a look at a task force that has been working for the last 2 years to decide whether and how much California's black citizens are owed. So, Ron, what'd you find?
A very passionate debate, Chuck. That California task force issues its final report at the end of this month. It's expected to make a case for why the state owes its black residents hundreds of billions of dollars and make dozens of policy recommendations as well, aimed at everything from increasing voter participation to improving K-12 black studies education. Nationally, some economists say the nation owes its black citizens some $14 trillion, reparations for lost family wealth, opportunity, and years of life itself. In Northern California, on the shores of the San Francisco Bay, Marion Johnson and her brother Michael know their way around this sprawling industrial park in the city of Hayward. Where are we right now?
We are on my father's mother's property.
Not what's there now, but what used to be. What was over here?
My grandmother's home would have been here.
Your grandmother's home is where that warehouse is now.
Right.
Yeah.
This was in the place where all the farming was done. She had a garden, then the houses to the back. My father and my uncle's houses would have been over there.
A community called Russell City, population about 1,400. One of the rare places where local laws did not prevent black families from owning property, with schools, churches, even a vibrant blues scene that attracted the likes of Ray Charles and Etta James.
Here's our tree.
And there's the willow tree. This is in the yard of our great-grandfather.
It's just by chance that the tree didn't get destroyed.
Yes, just by chance.
Chance or
Right. You got to wonder what the ancestors had in store.
They say this willow is all that remains of their family's property. In the early 1960s, local authorities declared Russell City, which did not have utilities like clean water and electricity, a blight area, seized the land and sold it to developers. That's your wedding picture, August 14th, 1960. Right. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Marion's mother, Jessie May, in her 20s then, witnessed some of her community's destruction.
I just remember that a lot of people were being burnt out.
They were trying to get people out.
Yes, and they did. They burned down churches. They burned down houses.
This is supposed to be the safe forever. We're going to plant our roots here, and we're going to build everything for our families here.
When people were forced to leave, was there any compensation at all?
Only for landowners, homeowners. So my grandmother, she got, I think, $2,200 for 6 lots. And my grandfather got, I think, $1,100 for his 2 lots.
So there was some compensation?
Yes. There was some compensation. And with eminent domain, you know, it's pennies on the dollar.
All your lives, you've been told, get the family's land back.
Yeah, by both sides.
Mm-hmm.
The Johnsons believe, based on stories passed down over the years and the few records they've been able to find, that local laws were used to devalue and unjustly take their family's land. That's why they and many other black families in the state say they're owed reparations. Why do you deserve reparations?
There's generational wealth that was stolen from us. We had to continue to rebuild every time. We would be further along if you hadn't done what was done to our family.
How much generational wealth do you think has been lost?
When you say how much, what do you mean? A dollar figure? It's priceless. I'm a homeowner. I shouldn't have to pay property taxes. I should have free medical insurance. I should be able to go to the school that I want to go to without having to pay.
My family was forced to move twice through Progress.
Across town in a Hayward suburb,
Was there any open land left?
Donna Whitmore says her family also knows loss.
Their houses were knocked down. My 92-year-old grandfather was forced to move, and his house knocked down where my mother and uncles were born.
Whitmore Susan Gelke and TJ Ferrara belong to Hayward Concerned Citizens, organized in response to calls to defund the police in their town. Now they're very concerned about calls for reparations.
I think we've all gone through something, and right now we're at a whole different place in our history.
2 years ago, Hayward issued a formal apology to Black, Indigenous, and people of color and Latinx community members for perpetuating institutional racism with its role in the destruction of Russell City. All residents were evicted and burned out of their homes and communities without appropriate compensation in 1966. The city also set up a committee that includes the Johnsons to search for any property records that will further document exactly what happened.
There's no white people mentioned.
Nor Asians are mentioned.
Yeah. Their apology really wanted to focus on our mistreatment of people of color.
And what's wrong with that?
Nothing, but everyone should be included in that because Russell City was a whole group of different races.
Here's an article in the Daily Review in 1960. This is the worst slum in Alameda County.
They insist their research shows people from numerous ethnic groups were forced to relocate over several decades across the Bay Area, and that Black families forced out of Russell City got fair compensation.
I think it was actually the best thing in the long run for many of these families because they were able to to go from no running water, no sewage, and no paved streets, and no fire protection to living in a community where you had all those right off the top.
The AB 3121 Task Force meeting is now called to order.
The Johnsons are among thousands of Californians sharing their stories with the state's Reparations Task Force.
I say, if you want to find out how much is owed, follow the money.
Signed into law by Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom in 2020.
We do not imitate, for we are a model to the world.
After a Democratic supermajority passed it through the legislature.
Ayes 52, noes 9, Senate amendments are concurred in.
The task force was established to study whether California owes Black residents reparations for unjust government actions, and if so, to develop proposals for eligibility and compensation. During dozens of public hearings, passionate public comment.
You can never repay for the damage have been done to Black people in America.
We have developed an entitlement mentality, and never has it been put on display more than with this disgraceful reparations board.
We need to do this. We need to get the money. Where's the money?
Do you think that people are actually going to get cash payments?
Yes. I do believe that people are actually going to get cash payments.
In South Central Los Angeles,
I think the state of California has the most local reparations initiatives.
We met Task Force Chair Camila Moore at her family's church.
I'm gonna give, God. You ought to give, God. Lift your hands and give, God.
Where she often comes for inspiration.
The Bible verse that I'm often reminded of is Proverbs 14:9. So that is fools mock at reparation, but amongst the upright there is favor.
What does that mean to you?
To me, that means that reparations is not a new concept. It's something that all communities are owed if they have suffered from gross human rights violations.
So you've traced your ancestors back to slavery?
Yes, on my father's side.
An attorney with expertise in international reparations. Moore walked us through the task force's draft report, starting with a history lesson about California, a free state when it entered the Union in 1850.
A lot of people don't know that there were over 2,500 enslaved Black people in the state of California.
Men and women brought west by Southerners during the gold rush and forced to work in the mines. Why do you think that Black Californians should receive reparations?
We're owed reparations for the debt owed from slavery due to the broken promise of Reconstruction in this country and the lingering badges and incidents or systemic discrimination that African Americans still face today.
The task force highlights housing discrimination and unlawful property seizures, discrimination against Black businesses, over-policing and mass incarceration in Black communities, healthcare inequality, why Black life expectancy is 7.5 years shorter than for white residents. Based on that gap and economic modeling, the task force estimates a health reparation payment of about $13,000 per year, or $966,921 for a 71-year-old lifelong resident. The task force recommends that any Black Californian who can trace their ancestry to an enslaved or free Black person living in the U.S. before 1900 should be eligible, about 2 million people. The final report also may include a California residency requirement. The numbers are just massive.
Yes. And the harm is massive. And so the solution has to be massive as well.
That's why your critics just think this is not, even if you could justify it, it's not workable. It's just not going to happen.
Well, I'll beg to disagree. Reparations is an idea whose time has come, and I see it coming to fruition despite the naysayers.
Obviously, slavery was an evil of almost indescribable proportions. But I think people in this country want to look forward. I think that things like this...
Congressman Kevin Kiley represents California's vast 3rd Congressional District. He's based in Rockland, a small conservative suburb near the capital, Sacramento. 3 years ago, Kiley was one of just 12 state assembly members, all Republicans, to vote against the law that established the task force. 58 Democrats supported it. Why did you vote against even studying the issue of reparations?
Well, because it was very clear from the beginning that this was something that was never actually going to happen.
Do you see a continuum at all, a connection to slavery, Jim Crow, to present-day inequality between black and white Californians?
I'm focused on the inequality that's the result of current policies in our state and in our country right now.
You're focused on now. They're trying to focus on a historical context that got us to where we are now.
And I'm focused on what we can do now. And so I happen to think that the absolute most transformative thing for people of any background to improve their life prospects is a good education. So you want to link that to all of these other sort of indicators of positive life outcomes, be it income, be it life expectancy, be it anything else. That is the single most powerful thing we can do.
Back in the Bay Area, the Johnsons are a big, close-knit middle-class family, sharing traditions like this potluck barbecue. But they say it's been a tough road getting there from Russell City because of the bigotry they faced even after moving to Oakland.
Well, I ask and pray that you bless the food, bless the hands that prepared it, and the mouths that are about to receive it. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Amen. Reason they're fighting for reparations. You've said you felt like you faced housing discrimination.
We did. The lending. You couldn't get anyone to finance you. I recall actually going to developments that were coming up to look at the model homes. Right. Every time we went, we would go in and look at the houses. By the time we got back to the office to get an application, it's vacant. Right. There were nothing there.
It was the 1970s in East Oakland, an era of rising crime and tension between black residents and police. 2 of her brothers spent time in prison.
Today, they are decent, loving, kind men. We've all gone to college. We own homes. We attend church. We help our community.
And for that reason, people would say, why are you entitled to reparations? You've made it.
It's not because of, it's in spite of what was done to us. You have to be resilient. We've always had to be resilient. We've always had to start from scratch.
We don't deny them their history. I mean, their story is very unique, and it holds a very prominent place in Hayward. Our issue, again, is from a very practical side. It's the taxpayer money, and they were compensated. They were compensated by the county.
I wasn't raised on generational wealth either. I had nothing. When my husband and I got married, we got married young. We had nothing but a mattress and a chair. That was it. And we struggled and we worked. We put ourselves through college. We never got money for that.
The Johnsons say the issue is more than just money.
I believe we are going to get this property back. I believe this tree stands here as a landmark to let them know this is our land.
And I'm back here with Ron Allen. Look, there's talk and there's action. What's the likelihood that this task force will actually implement a reparations plan for California black citizens?
All this goes to the state legislature, and they are the ones tasked with figuring out who's going to pay for it, how they're going to pay for it, and what actually is going to happen. It's a big menu of possibilities. And that's the details are still to be worked out. There is a lot to be worked out. What is important here is that they have gotten to this point where they are trying to justify this. They've sketched out a broad outline. And as you see, there are people like the Johnsons who are trying to fight for their land.
Governor Newsom has been interviewed by this, and he's like, it may not always be money. Right. And so this could be in services versus money, healthcare for life, or tax breaks versus writing checks.
And that's what's happened in the world. In Evanston, Illinois, for example, the one city where there are reparations being paid, it's basically a housing voucher program for people who can prove housing discrimination, a very limited number. In California, there's the case of Bruce's Beach, which was a piece of very pricey Manhattan beach land that the county recently returned to a family who proved that it had been taken unlawfully by eminent domain back in the 1920s. Those are things that people look to as to how this may turn out in the short run. But again, you heard the chairperson say there's going to be some cash.
Look, it's interesting. California considered a very blue state and had a supermajority. But this does not have majority support, even in the state of California does it. So this feels like a political wedge that we could see grow, no? And
critics say it's a political move by Governor Newsom and Democrats to ingratiate themselves, if you will, to the black community. But the task force says this is real. And they've spent 2 years doing this. It's a 1,000-page report that's coming out. They think it's a blueprint. They think it's a blueprint for the rest of the country as well.
Well, California has been a blueprint on so many things that eventually became either culturally relevant or actually enshrined into law. Ron Allen, terrific report. Thank you. When we come back, as more states debate the issue of reparations, where do Americans stand on the issue? What are the chances of this actually happening around the country outside of California? That's next. Welcome back. We want to dive in deeper. As we saw earlier, reparations is a hugely divisive issue. A Pew Research poll taken in late 2021 found that by a more than 2-to-1 margin, Americans oppose reparations for African Americans. And look at the racial split. Whites overwhelmingly oppose reparations, 80%. But the numbers are almost exactly reversed among African Americans who strongly support the idea. So joining me now is Cornell William Brooks. He's a professor of the practice of public leadership and social justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also a former president and CEO of the NAACP. And Coleman Hughes is a columnist and host of the Society and Culture podcast, Conversations with Coleman. Both of you have agreed to essentially lightly debate this issue with me as playing my role of moderator here. So, Cornell Brooks, let me start with you. You've been studying this for quite some time, and you've been working with some religious leaders to come up, I think it's fair to say, a modern blueprint of what you think, what would reparations look like in the 21st century? Make the case.
That's right. So I've had the pleasure and the honor of working with both the National Council of Churches and the Union of Reform Judaism and a group of Harvard Kennedy School students who are working with these large religious associations all across the country, representing over 40 million people, to create a moral discourse on reparations. Why? Because we know that in many corners of our republic, it's being politically weaponized. And they're endeavoring to make, I'd say, 3 key points here. The first of which is, with respect to reparations, you often hear that the harm was too long ago, it's too expensive, and too impossible, too difficult to do. What we find is the harm was not long ago, right? So in other words, yes, slavery ended in 1863 and 1865, but the convict leasing system, representing 1 million people enslaved, lasted up until the opening days of World War II, right? And all of these systems of oppression continue into the present, point one. Point two, with respect to reparations being too difficult. I want to know something here, Chuck, that's critically important. My colleague, Linda Bilmes, who's a public economist at the Harvard Kennedy School, we've done a study, and we looked at all of these programs across the federal government, and we make the case that we're already doing reparations. We simply don't call it that. So in other words, there's a norm in government which essentially says, if an American has been harmed through no fault of their own, the government will often step in to try to make them whole. We do this not only with respect to Japanese Americans who were interned after World War II, but we also do it with respect to veterans, with respect to people who suffered in a natural disaster. We do it with respect to children who've been harmed by vaccines. We do it with respect to pensions that are insured. So we do this over and over again, which says that we can do it. And lastly, we do it at the level of millions, billions, even trillions of dollars. So we can't afford to do it.
All right, Coleman Hughes, let me bring you in here. You testified before Congress in 2019 against the idea of reparations. You said paying reparations to descendants of slavery would, quote, only divide the country further. And you thought it would insult black Americans by putting a price on the suffering as well, and would make black Americans like yourself victims without their consent. I hope I captured that correctly, but you take it further. Make your case against.
So let me just make a distinction off the bat. I support reparations for redlining, right? Because there are many victims of redlining that are still with us. They're still alive. And Cornell, all the examples of successful reparations for other groups that you highlighted were examples of reparations given to directly the victims of these human rights abuses in their lifetimes or their immediate family members. That's why I support reparations for redlining paid directly to the victims, as they're doing in Evanston outside of Chicago. I make a distinction between that and reparations for slavery, which ended in 1865. I know of no examples where groups are getting reparations for historical crimes that are over 150 years old. And unfortunately, the opportunity was tragically missed to pay it to the slaves themselves or their immediate families. But claims like this time out, right? And this is timed out. And let me say one more thing. Martin Luther King had a plan for addressing the legacy of slavery, which he laid out in his book, Why We Can't Wait. And he called it the Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged. The Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged was not a race-based policy. It was a class-based anti-poverty program that would benefit the black poor and the white poor and the poor of all races. That's what I support in terms of addressing the legacy of slavery. That's what I feel is the wisest path forward for this country.
Let me follow up a little bit, Coleman, because it is interesting that there are some forms of specific areas where you believe a reparation of sorts should be put there. How do you distinguish Jim Crow? And what is the right amount of time? And I say that Germany is still paying reparations to now descendants of Holocaust victims. So what is the timeline where you feel like where you would draw the line?
So I think reasonable people can disagree on this, and I don't claim to have the last word on the subject, but I think we can all agree reparations should be paid ideally in the lifetime of the victim. If the victim dies, it should be paid to their spouse or to their children. Once you get to grandchildren and beyond, my personal view is that that's beyond my line. But like I said, reasonable people can disagree on this, but there's no doubt that, in my view, crimes from the 1850s and 60s are beyond the statute of limitations.
Do you see this where services can sort of be what is reparations? So maybe it is free college, maybe it's discounted college, maybe it is tax breaks, however you want to describe it. Is that an acceptable form in your opinion?
It is an acceptable form. And when we look at what we call reparatory compensation programs in government, they use a variety of strategies to help make people whole. But let's go to this point about indirect victims. When we look at the policies, when we look at government, when we look at history, we actually do compensate people who have suffered a harm indirectly and their heirs. Think about this. So in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right, Black Wall Street was bombed from the air. Homes were burned on the ground. No compensation, including for victims who are over 100 years old today. But when we bombed islands in the South Pacific, as in the U.S. government, we paid compensation to direct victims, indirect victims, and their heirs as a consequence of an American government bombing people on the ground. The point being here is when you look at reparatory compensation programs, what you find is the variety of direct and indirect victims who are compensated for nearly every group but black people.
I want to play a clip from Ronald Reagan after he signed a bill to repay Japanese Americans who were detained during World War II. Here's what he said in August of 1988.
Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
Coleman, is that a model for how America should deal with this? Could it be a model for how we dealt with Japanese Americans?
Like I said, the opportunity was missed in the lifetimes of slaves. I know of 0 examples of an ethnic group getting reparations 150 years after the crime in question. Now, when it comes to honor and symbolic apologies, I completely support those. I'd also like to point out many have been made and almost none have been really accepted by the spokespeople for Black Americans. So, for example, both houses of Congress officially apologized for slavery and Jim Crow in 2008 and 2009. The Senate officially apologized for lynching in 2004. Slavery is, of course, a state's issue, as you know, and at least 8 different southern states have issued official apologies for slavery. We have a beautiful museum in the nation's capital, which opened with an extensive exhibit on slavery in the Middle Passage, which was overflowing with patrons when it opened. I think we have made many gestures and symbolic gestures to give that sort of honor that Reagan was talking about.
Hey, Cornell and Coleman, you guys were terrific, very polite debate on something that can be very divisive in our society, but that was the whole point of why we invited you guys here. Thank you both, and thank you all for staying for this edition of Meet the Press Reports. Appreciate it. Our next episode, America's secret war on terror around the globe. My colleague Courtney Cubey takes us where no TV cameras have ever gone before, behind the scenes in Somalia, where U.S. Special Operations Forces have been fighting an erratic enemy known as Al-Shabaab. That's next for Meet the Press Reports, and I'll see you Sunday on Meet the Press.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.